You ever see a person's soul try to leave their body? Not in a quiet way, like on a deathbed. I mean, you ever see it get ripped out piece by painful piece, right in the middle of a town square under a sun so mean it could cook the devil himself? That's what I saw in Tombstone, Arizona, in the summer of '83. The summer the dust tasted like blood, and the law was just a joke somebody forgot the punchline to. Her name was Eleanor Grace, 22 years old, with eyes that held more fire than a blacksmith's forge, and a spine made of railroad steel. And that was the problem, you see. In a town like Tombstone, a woman with a steel spine is a threat. She was tied to a hitching post, the one right in front of the mayor's office. Her dress, a simple cotton thing, was torn down the back, exposing her skin to that hateful sun and the even more hateful eyes of the crowd. They'd gathered to watch a breaking. That's what they called it. The man who'd ordered it was Clayton Mercer, 50 years old with a face like a dried-up riverbed and a wallet so fat it had its own shadow. He owned half the county, all the cattle, and figured that gave him the right to own people too. He'd asked Eleanor to marry him 3 times, and 3 times she'd told him no. She said it politely the first time, firmly the second, and the third time, well, the third time she told him she'd sooner marry a rabid coyote. Mercer didn't take that well, so he went to Mayor Boone, a man whose spine was made of jelly, and he bought himself a piece of public humiliation. The charge? Public defiance and breaking a verbal contract. A lie, of course, but in Mercer's town, truth was whatever he paid for. The sheriff, a man named Calloway, just leaned against a post, picking at his teeth with a splinter of wood. He was on the payroll, too. Everyone was. The man with the whip, a big sweaty fella named Jeb, cracked it once in the air. The sound cut through the murmuring crowd like a gunshot. Little kids hid behind their mothers' skirts. The decent folks looked down at their boots. But nobody left. Nobody said a word. When the first lash hit it, the sound was wet. A sick, slapping noise that made my stomach turn. A line of red bloomed on Eleanor's back. But she didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just clenched her fists, her knuckles white, and stared straight ahead at the doors of the saloon across the square. Her silence was an accusation. It was louder than any scream could ever be. It shamed every single person standing there. Jeb licked his lips and drew the whip back again. This time a gasp rippled through the crowd as the leather bit deeper. Blood started to well up, tracing a path down her skin. Still, she said nothing. Her breath hitched, just once, but her eyes never wavered. It was her pride they were trying to break. But with every lash it seemed to get stronger, harder, forged in pain. The sun beat down. The smell of sweat and dust and fear hung thick in the air. Mayor Boone was smiling, a greasy, self-satisfied little smile. Mercer stood there with his arms crossed, watching like a man admiring his prized livestock. This wasn't just about a woman saying no. This was about power. This was Mercer showing the whole damn town that he was the sun they all revolved around, that he could blot out anyone who dared to cast a shadow. Jeb raised the whip for the third strike. He put his whole body into it, a cruel grin spreading across his face. He was enjoying this. The whip hung in the air for a heartbeat, a black snake ready to strike. And that's when we heard it. Clip-clop, clip-clop. It wasn't fast, it wasn't urgent. It was slow, deliberate. The sound of a horse walking at its own damn pace, like it had all the time in the world. But there was something in that rhythm, a cold, steady beat that cut through the tension. Every head in that square turned, every single one. Jeb's arm froze in midair. Down the long, dusty stretch of Main Street, a rider was coming. He was a silhouette against the blinding sun, long and lean in the saddle. A dark coat billowed out behind him, and his hat was pulled low, hiding his face in shadow. Dust kicked up from his horse's hooves in lazy puffs. He rode like he was part of the horse, a single, unstoppable force. He didn't slow down. He didn't speed up. He just kept that same steady, bone-chilling pace until his horse came to a stop right in the middle of the crowd, just a few yards from the post. The horse, a big black stallion, snorted, its breath fogging in the hot air. But the rider didn't move. He just sat there, surveying the scene. The silence that fell over Tombstone then was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of shame anymore. It was the silence of a graveyard at midnight. Mayor Boone, bless his cowardly heart, tried to take charge. He puffed out his chest and strutted forward a few steps. "Sir, this is official town business," he squeaked, his voice cracking. "I suggest you move along." The writer didn't even look at him. His hidden gaze was locked on Eleanor. He could see the blood, the sweat, the defiant set of her jaw. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It was low and flat, like a stone skipping over a frozen lake. "Cut her down." Just 3 words, but they landed like hammer blows. Deputy Hessler, a young kid who looked like he was about to be sick, looked at the mayor. Mayor Boone looked at Mercer. Mercer just stared at the writer, his eyes narrowing. "Now see here," Boone tried again, trying to find his footing. "This woman has been judged according to the law. She refused a lawful contract." The writer finally turned his head. Just a slight movement, but it felt like a mountain shifting. We couldn't see his eyes, but we could feel them. "You selling women now, Mayor?" A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was one thing to think it. It was another thing entirely to say it, out loud, in front of Clayton Mercer. Mercer himself finally stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dirt. His face was a thundercloud. "This is my business, stranger. I paid her father's debts, cleared his name. She owes me. By contract, she's mine." And that's when Eleanor, bruised and bleeding and barely able to stand, found her voice. It was a hoarse whisper, but it cut through the air like a razor. "My father never owed you a dime," she breathed. "He died clean." "You're a liar." Mercer's lips curled back in that snake-like smile. "A piece of paper in my safe says otherwise, girlie. Your father's signature, plain as day." This was the moment the story could have ended, with the whole town just shrugging and accepting the lie of a rich man. But then the rider swung his leg over his saddle. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, not like a brawler, but like a wolf. He walked right past Mercer, right past the mayor, and stopped in front of Eleanor. He was so close she could have reached out and touched him. Gently, he reached up and tilted his hat back. And the whole damn town froze. It wasn't a stranger. It was Jackson Cole, a man who hadn't been seen in these parts for 10 years. A man everyone thought was dead. A man who used to own the ranch right next to the Grace family before Clayton Mercer ran him out of town on a trumped-up rustling charge. He looked different, harder. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, and his eyes looked like they'd seen hell and hadn't bothered to blink. He looked at Eleanor, his voice softer now. "Eleanor, did your father owe that man a single cent?" She met his gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than defiance showed in her eyes. "Hope." "No, Jackson. Never." He gave a single sharp nod. Then he turned, and his eyes swept over Mercer, the mayor, and the sheriff. His voice was cold iron again, and this time, it was loud enough for God himself to hear. "I said, cut her down." Mayor Boone went from red to a pasty white. He looked at Mercer for help, but Mercer was just staring at Jackson, a look of pure, venomous hatred on his face. This wasn't just a stranger interrupting his fun. This was a ghost from his past, come back to haunt him. The sheriff Calloway finally decided to earn his pay. He shifted his weight and his hand drifted down, casual-like, toward the butt of his pistol. "Now hold on, Cole. You got no authority here." Jackson's hand dropped to his own hip. He didn't draw. He didn't even touch his gun. He just let his hand hover there, a breath away from the worn leather of his holster. One move, that's all it was. But in that one move, you could see the years of experience, the countless hours of practice, the chilling certainty of a man who knew exactly how fast he was. Sheriff Calloway's hand froze. He suddenly looked like he'd swallowed a block of ice. Every hired gun in that square, every man who thought he was tough, suddenly remembered what real danger felt like. It wasn't a whip or a fat wallet. It was a man with nothing left to lose and the skill to take everything from you. The deputy Hessler, the young one, let out a shaky breath and pulled a knife from his belt. He didn't wait for an order. He ran forward and sawed at the ropes holding Eleanor's wrists. The moment she was free, her knees buckled. But Jackson was there. He caught her before she hit the ground, sweeping her up into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. He didn't spare another glance for Mercer or the mayor. He turned, carried her to his horse, and mounted in one smooth motion, settling her in front of him. He looked at the crowd one last time. His eyes were chips of flint. "This town has a sickness," he said, his voice echoing in the dead quiet, "and I reckon I'm the cure." With a nudge of his heels, the black stallion turned and began to walk away, leaving the mayor, the sheriff, and the most powerful man in the county standing there in the dust, utterly defeated. But as they rode out of Tombstone, a question burned in my mind and in the mind of everyone who watched them go. This wasn't just about justice for a girl. This was personal. This was about something old and buried. And Clayton Mercer was not the kind of man to let a ghost ride away with what he considered his property. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a war. They rode until the sky bled from orange to purple. Jackson didn't push the horse. He just kept a steady pace, letting the rhythm soothe Eleanor as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her head rested against his chest, her breathing shallow. He could feel the fever starting to burn through her skin. She needed a doctor. She needed rest. And they both needed to disappear. The landscape turned hostile, all sharp rocks and skeletal cacti. They were heading into the Badlands, a place where the law didn't even pretend to reach. It was a gamble. Hiding in plain sight was one thing, but running into the wilderness meant facing a different kind of danger. They finally saw a flicker of light, a single lantern hanging from a crooked post. The sign above the door was so faded you could barely read it. Miller's Outpost. It was less a trading post and more a shack that looked like it was one bad storm away from collapsing. But it was shelter. An old man with a limp hobbled out, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. He had watery eyes and a face etched with the kind of loneliness that comes from living too long with no one but the wind for company. "Trouble?" he rasped, looking at Eleanor's blood-soaked dress and then at Jackson's hard face. "We need a room," Jackson said, his voice flat. "And bandages. Whatever you've got." The old man Miller nodded slowly. "Got a cot in the back. Stew on the fire. Won't ask no questions if you don't bring no more trouble to my door." He looked back out into the oppressive darkness. "Mercer's men ride this way sometimes." The warning hung in the air. Jackson dismounted carefully, lifting Eleanor down. She moaned, her eyes fluttering open for a second. "Jackson?" "Rest," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He carried her inside. The place smelled of dust, old tobacco, and something else. Desperation. Miller gave them a small, windowless room in the back. It had a lumpy cot and a bucket of clean water. It was heaven. Jackson carefully laid Eleanor down, and with Miller's help, cleaned the wounds on her back. They were deep, ugly. He packed them with some kind of herbal salve the old man provided. For a few hours there was a strange kind of peace. The stew was thin but hot. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire and Eleanor's quiet breathing. Jackson sat in a chair by the door, his pistol in his lap, watching, waiting. He didn't trust Miller. He didn't trust anyone. But exhaustion is a patient enemy. His eyelids grew heavy. The firelight danced, hypnotic. He must have drifted off for just a moment. What woke him was a change in the air, a subtle shift. He was instantly awake, his senses screaming. He looked at Eleanor. She was still asleep. He looked at the fire in the main room. It had burned down to embers. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. He stood up, his movements silent, and crept to the front door. He peered through a crack in the wood. Outside, the moon was high. Nothing but rocks and shadows. But then he saw it. In the old fire pit out front, where Miller probably burned his trash, there was a pile of ashes. And from the very center of that pile, a tiny, almost invisible wisp of smoke was rising. It wasn't the lazy smoke of a dying fire. It was a thin, straight line, climbing directly into the sky. A signal. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Jackson. He turned, his face a mask of stone, and kicked open the door to Miller's small sleeping quarters. The old man shot up in his bed, his eyes wide with terror. "Where is it?" Jackson growled, his voice a low threat. What? I don't know what you're talking about," Miller stammered, pulling a thin blanket up to his chin. Jackson crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed the front of the old man's shirt, hauling him out of bed. "The telegraph! The one you just used to tell Clayton Mercer exactly where we are." Eleanor, woken by the commotion, appeared in the doorway of her room, leaning against the frame for support. He sold us out?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Old man Miller's face crumpled. The fight went right out of him, replaced by a pathetic sort of despair. "He offered me gold," he whimpered, tears tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks. "More money than I've seen in 20 years. He said he just wanted the girl. He said he'd let you live if I helped." Jackson stared at the sniveling man, his knuckles white. "And here's the thing about cowards. They always believe the lies that let them sleep at night. They always think their own survival is worth more than anyone else's soul. Jackson didn't hit him. He didn't have to. He just dropped him." Miller landed in a heap on the floor, sobbing. Jackson turned to Eleanor. "We have to go. Now." He slung her back onto the horse, ignoring her protests of pain, and vaulted up behind her. He didn't look back at the outpost. He spurred the stallion into a gallop, plunging them back into the unforgiving darkness of the Badlands. They rode for what felt like an eternity. The moon was their only guide. Every shadow looked like a rider. Every gust of wind sounded like a gunshot. And then, not an hour later, they saw it. Far behind them, on the ridge they had just crossed, a single point of light appeared. Then another, and another, a line of torches, moving fast. They were being hunted. Mercer's men were on their trail, and they were closing in. The small flicker of hope they'd found at the outpost had been nothing but bait for a trap. And now the jaws of that trap were about to snap shut. The chase was relentless. Jackson pushed the stallion harder than he ever had before, the horse's lungs burning, its hooves striking sparks against the rocks. Eleanor held on tight, her body screaming with every jolt, but she didn't make a sound. She knew, just as he did, that any sign of weakness, any hesitation, would be their end. The torches behind them grew brighter, closer. He could hear the faint sound of shouts carried on the wind. They were gaining. Mercer must have sent his best trackers, men who knew these badlands like the back of their own hands. Jackson veered off the trail, heading into a narrow, winding canyon. It was a desperate move. Canyons could be traps, dead ends, but it was their only chance to break the line of sight, to confuse the pursuit. The walls of rock rose up on either side of them, swallowing the moonlight, plunging them into an almost absolute darkness. The horse stumbled, its breath coming in ragged gasps. "Easy, boy," Jackson murmured, his hand on its neck. He could feel the animal trembling with exhaustion. It couldn't keep this pace for much longer. Suddenly, a gunshot echoed through the canyon. The bullet whizzed past Jackson's head, so close he felt the heat of it, and slammed into the rock wall beside them, showering them with stone chips. They weren't just following, they were in range. "Hold on!" Jackson yelled, and he urged the horse into a final, desperate burst of speed. They rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, and for a moment they were out of the line of fire. But up ahead, the canyon walls narrowed even further. It was a bottleneck, a perfect place for an ambush, and Jackson knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that they were out of options. The horse was spent. Eleanor was fading, and Mercer's men were right behind them. He spotted a small crevice in the canyon wall, barely big enough for them to squeeze through. It was hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes. Without a second thought, he reined the horse in, dismounted, and half-carried, half-dragged Eleanor towards it. "We hide here," he said, his voice grim. "It's our only chance." He pushed her into the narrow space between the rocks and then led the horse further down the canyon, slapping its rump hard. "Go! Get out of here!" The loyal animal, riderless, galloped off into the darkness, a perfect decoy. Jackson scrambled back to the crevice and squeezed in beside Eleanor, pulling the thorny bushes back over the entrance. They were cramped, hidden in the pitch black. Listening. The sounds of the approaching riders grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Hoofbeats thundered past their hiding spot. Shouts and curses filled the air. "He went this way! I saw the horse!" They listened as the riders galloped past, their voices fading down the canyon. For a moment, a sliver of hope. Maybe the decoy had worked. Maybe they were safe. They waited in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. The only sound was their own ragged breathing. 1 minute passed, then two, then a new sound, the crunch of a single boot on gravel. Right outside their hiding place, a low, cruel voice chuckled in the darkness. "You can't fool an old tracker, Cole. A horse without a rider? The oldest trick in the book." A hand ripped the bushes away from the entrance. A face appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. It was Jed, the man who had wielded the whip, a massive, ugly grin splitting his face. Behind him, 3 more of Mercer's men stood, their rifles leveled. "The boss wants the girl," Jed sneered, "and he wants you dead. Looks like I get to deliver both." There was nowhere to run. They were trapped, cornered like animals. Jackson instinctively moved to shield Eleanor with his body, his hand going for his gun. But before he could even clear the holster, something happened that no one expected. From the rocks above them, another voice cut through the night. It wasn't rough or mean. It was smooth, calm, and carried an unnerving authority. "I do believe the Lord teaches us to show mercy to those in distress." Jed and his men spun around, their guns pointing up into the darkness. "Who's there? Show yourself!" A figure emerged on the ridge above them. He was a tall, thin man, dressed all in black, with a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. In the moonlight, a silver cross hanging around his neck glinted. A preacher. "Put down your weapons, my sons," the preacher said, his voice echoing in the canyon. "Violence begets only more violence." Jed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A preacher? You're a long way from a church, old man. Get out of here before you get hurt." The preacher sighed, a sound of theatrical sadness. "I was afraid you'd say that." And then he moved. He moved with a speed that was anything but holy. One moment he was on the ridge, the next he was leaping down, his black coat flaring out like the wings of a crow. He landed silently on the canyon floor, and in his hands were no longer a Bible, but 2 massive, silver-plated Colt revolvers. He fanned the hammers. The gunshots were deafening in the enclosed space. 2 of Mercer's men dropped without a sound. The third stared in disbelief, his rifle falling from his nerveless fingers. Jed, the big whipper, was tougher. He managed to get a shot off, but the preacher moved like smoke, and the bullet went wide. The preacher's second gun barked, and Jed staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of shock and pain. The preacher walked forward calmly, the barrels of his gun still smoking. He stopped in front of the wounded Jed, who had fallen to his knees. "The boss, Mercer, he'll pay you double," Jed gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. The preacher smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer already paid me. My name is Reverend Silas Kane. I'm a bounty hunter, and my contract is to bring the girl back, alive." He looked over at Jackson, who was still in the crevice, his own gun now drawn. The contract said nothing about keeping her protector in one piece. The twist was sickening. They hadn't been saved. They had been captured by a far more dangerous predator. This man wasn't just a hired gun. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a killer who used faith as a disguise. "Get out of the hole, Cole," the Reverend said, his guns now aimed squarely at them. "Your journey has come to an end. It's time to repent." Jackson's mind raced. He was a fast draw, but this man, this Reverend Silas Kane, was something else entirely. He was a professional, cold and efficient. A straight fight was suicide. He slowly pushed himself out of the crevice, keeping his hands raised where Kane could see them. Eleanor followed, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. "You work for Mercer?" Jackson asked, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to buy time. "Mr. Mercer is a client," Kane said smoothly, his guns never wavering. "He has a problem. I provide a solution. It's a simple and very profitable business relationship. He wants the girl for his own reasons. I just want the gold." He gestured with one of his pistols towards the horses the dead men had been riding. "We'll be taking your mounts. You'll ride with me back to Tombstone. I trust you won't cause any trouble." Jackson looked at Eleanor. He could see the despair in her eyes. After everything they had been through, to be captured now, to be dragged back to that monster Mercer. It was a fate worse than death. He knew he had to do something, anything. As he walked toward the horses, he stumbled, lurching forward. It was a calculated risk. For a split second, Kane's attention would be diverted. It worked. Kane's eyes flickered down for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, Eleanor acted. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a gunslinger, but she was a survivor. With a desperate cry, she scooped up a handful of gravel and dirt from the canyon floor and threw it with all her might into the bounty hunter's face. It was a small act, a desperate, hopeless gesture. But it was enough. Reverend Kane cried out in surprise and pain, instinctively raising a hand to shield his eyes. His aim faltered for a single, crucial second. Jackson didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, not at the guns, but at the man himself. He slammed his shoulder into Kane's chest, sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and black cloth. One of Kane's pistols flew from his grasp, skittering across the rocks. The other was still clutched in his hand, trapped between their bodies. They wrestled in the dust, two desperate men fighting for their lives. Kane was wiry and surprisingly strong, all coiled muscle and vicious intent. He brought a knee up hard into Jackson's ribs, and Jackson grunted in pain. Kane tried to bring the pistol around to press it against Jackson's side. Jackson grabbed his wrist, their hands locked in a desperate struggle. The barrel of the gun wavered, pointing at the sky, then at the ground, then back towards them. "Eleanor, run!" Jackson yelled, straining with every fiber of his being. But Eleanor didn't run. She scrambled across the ground, her eyes searching for the other gun. She saw it, glinting in the moonlight near the canyon wall. She grabbed the heavy Colt, her hands shaking. She'd never held a gun like this before. It felt alien, heavy, an instrument of death. She pointed it at the struggling forms on the ground. But they were moving too fast, a chaotic blur of black and brown. She couldn't get a clear shot. She was afraid of hitting Jackson. Kane, with a surge of strength, twisted his hand and the gun went off. The shot was muffled, fired into the dirt right beside Jackson's head. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and acrid. Using the recoil, Kane shoved Jackson back and scrambled to his feet. He still had one gun, and he raised it, his face a mask of fury. The calm preacher persona completely gone, replaced by the cold-blooded killer beneath. But in that moment, as he was raising his weapon, Jackson, still on the ground, kicked out with both feet, sweeping Kane's legs out from under him. The bounty hunter went down hard, his head cracking against a rock with a sickening thud. He lay still. Silence descended on the canyon once more, broken only by their ragged, desperate gasps for air. Jackson slowly got to his feet, clutching his ribs. He looked at Eleanor, who was still holding the heavy pistol with both hands, her knuckles white. He walked over to the unconscious form of Reverend Kane and kicked the last gun from his hand. He was alive. They were both alive. But as he knelt down to check the bounty hunter's pockets, searching for anything that might help them, his fingers closed around a small, leather-bound book. It wasn't a Bible. It was a ledger. And as he opened it, his blood ran cold. Inside were names, dozens of them. Names of men and women from all over the territory. Beside each name was a price and a single word: acquired, delivered, or terminated. But it was the last entry that made his breath catch in his throat. It was dated 2 days ago. The name was Eleanor Grace. The price was $5,000 in gold, and beside it, scrawled in neat, precise handwriting, was a note. Client, C. Mercer. Objective, retrieve the girl. Bonus paid upon acquisition of the Grace family deed. Property contains a significant silver lode, as per client's geological survey. It all clicked into place: the cruelty, the obsession, the public humiliation. It was never about a refused marriage proposal. It was never just about pride. It was about silver. It was about a secret her father had died with. A fortune buried beneath their small, dusty ranch. And Clayton Mercer knew all about it. This whole nightmare was nothing more than a violent, brutal land grab. And now they didn't just have a reason to run. They had a reason to fight back. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. The silver. It recontextualized everything. Her father hadn't been a simple rancher. He had been the guardian of a secret that had ultimately cost him his life. Mercer hadn't been a spurned suitor. He was a predator who had been circling their land for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. He killed him, Eleanor whispered, the words barely audible. She looked at Jackson, her eyes shining with a terrible new understanding. Mercer! He must have killed my father to get to that land. Jackson looked at the ledger, then back at her. He didn't have proof, but he knew in his gut she was right. Mercer wouldn't have left a man alive who knew about that silver. They tied up the unconscious Reverend Kane, leaving him for whatever justice the desert decided to deliver. They took his horses, his guns, and his water, and the ledger. That was the most important thing of all. But Jackson knew the ledger alone wasn't enough. It was a bounty hunter's private record. Mercer could deny it, claim Kane was a liar. They needed more. They needed irrefutable proof. The deed, Jackson said, his voice low and intense. He mentioned the Grace family deed. Where would your father have kept it? Eleanor thought for a moment, her mind racing back through memories of her childhood. The old homestead, she said suddenly. We moved into town after my mother died, but he always kept the original cabin. Said it was the heart of our family. He had a strong box hidden under the floorboards. It was a long shot, a dangerous one. The homestead was back towards Mercer's territory. Going there would be like a mouse running back into the cat's den, but it was their only play. We have to go there, she said, her voice stronger now, laced with a new resolve. The victim was gone. In her place was a woman with a mission. They rode through what was left of the night, not towards safety, but back towards the heart of the danger. They avoided the main trails, sticking to the shadows, moving like ghosts through the pre-dawn gloom. They reached the Grace homestead as the first rays of sun crested the horizon. It was a small, sad-looking cabin, weathered and worn, but it stood defiant against the harsh landscape. It looked peaceful, but Jackson knew better. He dismounted a quarter-mile away, hidden in a rocky outcrop. Stay here, he told Eleanor. I'll scout it out. He crept forward, using every rock and bush for cover, his eyes scanning every window, every shadow. The place seemed deserted. No horses, no guards. It was too easy. Mercer was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He would have men watching the place. Jackson circled the cabin, his senses on high alert. He found them on the north side, hidden in a dry riverbed. Two men sleeping soundly by a cold campfire, their rifles leaning against their bedrolls. Mercer's guards. They must have thought no one would be foolish enough to return. Jackson crept back to Eleanor. 2 men asleep. I can take them. No, she said, her hand on his arm. No more killing if we can help it. There has to be another way. She was right. Leaving a trail of bodies would only make them look like outlaws. They needed to be smarter. The back window, she said. The one to the pantry. The latch was always broken. They circled around, moving with a silence born of desperation. The window was small and high, but Eleanor was slender. Jackson hoisted her up and she managed to wiggle through, dropping silently to the floor inside. A moment later, the back door creaked open. The cabin was thick with the smell of dust and old memories. Moonlight streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating floating dust motes. It was like a tomb. The main room, Eleanor whispered, leading the way. Under the hearthstone. Together they pried at the large flat stone in front of the fireplace. It was heavy, but it shifted, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. And inside that space was a heavy, iron strongbox. It was locked. The key, Jackson said. Did he have a key? Eleanor shook her head, her face falling. He always wore it around his neck. It would have been on him when he died. It was a dead end. They had found the box, but they couldn't open it. Jackson drew his pistol. I can try to shoot the lock. No, Eleanor hissed. The noise will bring the guards. It could bring the whole damn county down on us. They were stuck. The proof they needed was inches away, locked inside a box they couldn't open. The sun was rising higher, and Mercer's men wouldn't sleep forever. And then Eleanor's eyes lit up. She rushed to an old, dusty bookshelf and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound family Bible. She frantically flipped through the pages. My father was a man of routines, a man of faith. She stopped at the book of Proverbs. Tucked carefully between the pages was a small, ornate iron key. With trembling hands, she took the key to the strongbox. She inserted it into the lock. It turned with a rusty, grating sound. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed velvet, were two documents. The first was the official deed to the Grace property, signed and sealed. The second was a handwritten letter from her father. She began to read it aloud, her voice shaking. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the worst has come to pass. The secret of our land is both a blessing and a curse. There is a rich vein of silver running beneath the north pasture. I made a deal with Clayton Mercer. He would provide the capital to open a mine, and we would split the profits. He signed a partnership agreement, but I saw the greed in his eyes. He doesn't want a partner. He wants it all. I fear for my life. I have hidden the original partnership agreement for safekeeping. If anything happens to me, take this letter and the deed to Judge Peterson in Prescott. He is an honest man. Do not trust anyone in Tombstone, especially not Sheriff Calloway. But she never finished the letter, because at that moment, the front door of the cabin burst open, splintering off its hinges. Clayton Mercer stood there, a shotgun in his hands. Behind him were a dozen of his men, including the two guards from the riverbed, looking sheepish. And standing beside Mercer, a cruel smile on his face, was Sheriff Calloway. I appreciate you finding that for me, girl, Mercer said, his eyes fixed on the box in her hands. Saves me the trouble of tearing this whole place apart. Calloway stepped forward, his own pistol drawn. It's over, Jackson. We found your bounty hunter friend. He was very talkative once we helped him remember his manners. We knew you'd come here. They had walked right into the lion's den. Every move they had made, every small victory, had just been leading them deeper into the trap. There was no Judge Peterson in Prescott to run to. There was no escape. Mercer's eyes glinted with triumph. Give me the box, Eleanor. Do that, and I'll let Jackson here die quick. The finality of it was suffocating. The proof, the truth, the hope they had just uncovered was about to be snuffed out. Jackson stood in front of Eleanor, his own gun in his hand, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. 1 man against 13. The odds weren't just bad, they were impossible. This was the end of the line. But then Eleanor did something that changed everything. She looked Mercer dead in the eye and she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a cornered animal that had decided to bite back, no matter the cost. You want it? She said, her voice clear and steady. Come and get it. And she threw the strongbox, not at Mercer, but into the roaring fireplace behind them. The fire, which they had lit for a little light and warmth, engulfed the iron box. The old, dry papers inside, the deed, the letter, would be ash in a matter of seconds. Mercer screamed in rage. No, you foolish girl! He and his men surged forward, their attention focused entirely on the fireplace, on the fortune that was turning to smoke before their very eyes. And in that moment of chaos, that split second of distraction, Jackson acted. Now, he yelled. He shoved Eleanor towards the broken back window, firing his pistol not at the men, but at the large oil lamp hanging from a ceiling beam. The lamp shattered, raining burning oil down onto the dry wooden floor. Flames erupted, spreading with terrifying speed, creating a wall of fire between them and Mercer's men. Jackson scrambled out the window after Eleanor as smoke and screams filled the cabin. They didn't look back. They ran for the horses, the sound of gunshots and angry yells pursuing them. They leaped into the saddles and spurred the horses into a dead run, leaving the burning cabin and their only proof behind them. They were alive. They were free. But they had nothing. The ledger was one man's word. The deed was gone. Mercer had won. He would rebuild. He would dig his mine, and they would be fugitives with a price on their heads for the rest of their lives. As they rode, the smoke from the burning homestead rising like a funeral pyre behind them, despair began to set in. "It's over," Eleanor said, her voice hollow. "We lost." "We're not dead yet," Jackson said, but his own words sounded hollow. Where could they go? Who would believe the word of a wanted man and a branded woman against the most powerful man in the territory? They rode for hours, putting as much distance as they could between them and their past. The landscape shifted again, the harsh desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak. And then Jackson reined in his horse. "I know a place," he said. "One last chance. A friend. He owes me a favor." He led them to a place that wasn't on any map. A small hidden rancheria tucked away in a series of rocky canyons, a place the white men avoided. Rancho del Sol. It was a sanctuary for a small band of Apache who had refused to be herded onto a reservation. As they approached, figures emerged from the shadows, silent and watchful, rifles held at the ready. An older Apache man with a face like carved granite stepped forward. "Jackson Cole," he said. His voice was not surprised but wary. "You bring trouble with you, again." "Joseph," Jackson said, dismounting. "This is Joseph Crow. We served together." He looked at his old friend. "I need your help. We're out of time, and out of friends." Joseph Crow looked at Eleanor, at the exhaustion and defiance in her eyes. He looked at the hard set of Jackson's jaw. He was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes seeming to weigh their souls. "Mercer's men will not be welcome here," he said finally. "You can rest, for now." It was a temporary reprieve, and they all knew it. For a few days they found a fragile peace at Rancho del Sol. The Apache women tended to Eleanor's wounds, which were finally beginning to heal. Jackson and Joseph spoke in low tones, recounting the years since they had last seen each other. Two veterans of different wars, bound by a shared history of loss and survival. Eleanor watched them. She watched the quiet dignity of the Apache people, their resilience in the face of a world that wanted to erase them. And she felt something shifting inside her. The fear was still there, but it was being burned away by a cold, hard anger. She asked Joseph to teach her to shoot. He didn't question her. He simply handed her a rifle. It was heavy, solid. She spent hours practicing, her shoulder aching from the recoil, her hands raw. At first, she couldn't hit the side of a canyon, but she didn't give up. Day after day, she practiced, her focus absolute. She was no longer just surviving. She was preparing. The peace was shattered one afternoon by a lookout's cry. From the ridge overlooking the rancheria, a cloud of dust was rising. A large group of riders. Mercer. He had found them. He must have tortured the information out of Reverend Kane, or followed their tracks with an army of trackers. It didn't matter how. He was here, and he hadn't come to talk. Jackson stood beside Joseph, a rifle in his hand. They were horribly outnumbered. Joseph had maybe 15 warriors. Mercer had at least 40 men, armed to the teeth. "You should take the woman and go," Joseph said, his voice calm. "Through the back canyons. We will hold them off." Jackson looked at him. "You know they'll burn this place to the ground. They'll kill everyone." "We have fought worse odds," Joseph said with a grim smile. "This is our land. We do not run." But Eleanor stepped forward, her own rifle held in her hands. She looked at Joseph, then at Jackson. "I'm not running either," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "This started with me. It ends with me." Jackson looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not the girl he'd rescued, but the woman she had become. Forged in fire and blood, she was as unyielding as the land itself. The first shot of the battle wasn't fired by Jackson. It wasn't fired by Joseph's warriors. It was fired by Eleanor. One of Mercer's men, a cocky outrider who had ventured too close, tumbled from his saddle, a clean shot through the chest. A stunned silence fell over the attackers. They hadn't expected resistance like this. They certainly hadn't expected it from her. And then all hell broke loose. The canyon erupted in a storm of gunfire. Mercer's men charged, whooping and yelling, expecting to overrun the small rancheria in minutes. They were wrong. Joseph Crow and his warriors were masters of this terrain. They weren't soldiers fighting in a line. They were ghosts. They fired from hidden positions among the rocks, their shots precise, deadly. They would fire and then melt away, reappearing in a different spot, making their small numbers seem like an army. Jackson fought with the cold efficiency of a man who had seen the worst of war. He moved from cover to cover, his rifle barking, each shot finding its mark. He was a bulwark, a steady presence in the chaos, protecting the non-combatants huddled in the clay houses. But it was Eleanor who was the heart of the defense. She crouched behind a low adobe wall, reloading and firing with a terrifying calm. She wasn't just shooting wildly, she was picking her targets. She targeted the leaders, the men who were shouting orders, sowing confusion in the enemy ranks. Every time one of Mercer's men fell, the resolve of the others weakened. The tide of the battle began to turn. The initial confident charge of Mercer's men faltered, breaking against the unyielding rock of the Apache defense and the fiery spirit of a woman they had fatally underestimated. But Mercer was a man possessed by greed. He wasn't going to give up. He had brought a surprise. From the back of the attacking force, several men wheeled a heavy object forward. It was a Gatling gun. The chattering, mechanical roar of the weapon cut through the air, a sound of industrial death. It scythed through the adobe walls, splintering wood and kicking up clouds of dust. Joseph's warriors were pinned down. The defense was crumbling. All seemed lost. The sheer, overwhelming firepower was too much. "We have to fall back," Jackson yelled over the din, pulling Eleanor behind a solid rock formation. But Joseph Crow shook his head. He pointed to the top of the canyon ridge, high above the Gatling gun's position. 3 of his best warriors were already moving, climbing the sheer rock face like lizards, silent and unseen. It was a desperate gamble. Down below, Mercer, sensing victory, strode forward, directing the fire of the Gatling gun himself. "Kill them all!" he roared, his face contorted with hate. "Burn it all to the ground. That silver is mine." Suddenly, a cry from above. One of the Apache warriors on the ridge let out a war whoop. He had a bundle of something in his hands. It was on fire. He hurled it down toward the Gatling gun. It was a bundle of rags soaked in pitch, a primitive but effective weapon. It landed just short. Mercer laughed. "Is that all you've got, you savages?" But it wasn't the target. It was a distraction. While all eyes were on the first warrior, the other 2 had taken aim, not at the gun, but at the large wooden ammunition boxes stacked right beside it. 2 rifles cracked from the ridge. The ammunition boxes exploded in a massive fireball of splinters and shrapnel. The men operating the Gatling gun were thrown back, screaming. The gun itself was overturned, silenced. The roar of the weapon was replaced by the stunned silence of Mercer's men. Their ultimate weapon was gone. Their advantage was lost. And now they were trapped in a canyon with warriors who were picking them off one by one. Panic set in. Some of Mercer's men started to break, running for their horses. The fight had gone out of them. Jackson saw his chance. "It's Mercer!" he yelled to Eleanor. "We have to get him!" He broke cover, running in a low crouch towards Mercer's position. Eleanor was right behind him, providing covering fire. Mercer, his face black with soot and fury, saw them coming. He drew his pistol and fired, but his hands were shaking with rage. The shot went wide. Jackson tackled him, and they went down in the dust, a mirror image of the fight with the bounty hunter. But this was different. This wasn't about survival. This was about vengeance. They rolled on the ground, trading blows, 2 men fueled by years of hatred. Mercer was bigger, stronger, but Jackson was faster, more skilled. Eleanor stood over them, her rifle aimed, but she couldn't get a clear shot. Sheriff Calloway, who had been hiding behind a wagon, saw his opportunity. He raised his pistol, aiming it straight at the back of Jackson's head. He never fired. A gunshot cracked from Eleanor's rifle. Calloway gasped, a look of utter surprise on his face, and crumpled to the ground. The distraction was all Jackson needed. He landed a solid punch on Mercer's jaw, dazing him. He scrambled on top of him, pressing the barrel of his own pistol under the man's chin. "It's over, Mercer," Jackson panted. Mercer just laughed, a crazy gurgling sound. "You have nothing, Cole. The deed is burned. No one will believe you." "They'll believe this," a voice said. Jackson and Eleanor looked up. Standing there on the edge of the battlefield were a dozen men on horseback. They weren't Apaches. They weren't Mercer's men. They wore the dusty uniforms of the U.S. Marshals. and at their lead was a grim-faced man with a silver star pinned to his chest. Behind them, tied to a horse, was a bruised and battered Reverend Silas Kane. The lead marshal dismounted. Reverend Kane here was found by one of our patrols. He was very eager to trade his testimony for a lighter sentence. Told us all about a certain geological survey and a bounty on a Miss Eleanor Grace. He looked down at Mercer, his expression one of utter contempt. Clayton Mercer, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and a list of other charges, so long it'll take until Christmas to read them all. Checkmate. Mercer's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine fear. He had built his empire on the belief that he was above the law, and now the law had come for him in the middle of a canyon filled with the bodies of his own men. The surviving members of Mercer's gang threw down their weapons, their hands shooting into the air. The fight was over. Justice, against all odds, had found its way to Rancho del Sol. Jackson finally stood up, pulling a gasping Mercer to his feet and shoving him towards the marshals. He turned to Eleanor. They were both covered in dust and blood, exhausted and bruised, but they were standing. They were victorious. In the quiet aftermath, as the marshals rounded up the prisoners, Joseph Crow came and stood beside them. He looked at the carnage, then at Eleanor. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands. "You have the spirit of a warrior, Eleanor Grace," he said, his voice filled with a deep, quiet respect. "Your ancestors would be proud." They buried the dead. The Apache warriors who had fallen were given their sacred rites. The bodies of Mercer's men were stacked for the marshals to take back. Tombstone was never the same. With Mercer and his cronies gone, the town had a chance to breathe again, to find its soul. The story of the siege at Rancho del Sol became a legend, a cautionary tale about greed and a testament to the power of a few brave people standing up to a tyrant. Eleanor got her land back. The silver mine she eventually opened brought prosperity not just to her, but to the whole region. She made sure the Apache people at Rancho del Sol were given a share of the profits, a protected title to their land, and the respect they had long been denied. She never became a lady of high society. She remained the tough, resilient woman who had been forged in the crucible of that terrible summer. And Jackson? He stayed. The ghost who had ridden into town to settle a score found that he had something to live for again. He and Eleanor never spoke much about what they had been through. They didn't have to. They had lived it together. They built a new house on the Grace homestead, right where the old cabin had burned down. They built a life. Sometimes when the wind blew just right through the canyons, you could almost hear the echoes of the battle. But more often than not, you could hear the sound of laughter. The kind of laughter that only comes from people who have walked through hell together and come out the other side. Stronger, not just as survivors, but as partners. Their story shows us something important. It shows that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and standing your ground anyway. It's about finding that steel in your spine when the world is trying its best to break you. And it reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't silver buried in the ground. It's the loyalty of a true friend, the strength you find within yourself, and the freedom to build your own damn future. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that tales of justice and resilience are worth telling, then do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We have a lot more stories like this one, stories that remind us of the best and the worst that people can be. But before you go, I want you to think about something. When Jackson Cole rode into Tombstone, he was one man against a whole town. He could have kept riding. He could have told himself it wasn't his fight, but he didn't. What would you have done? Would you have been the one to step forward? Let us know in the comments below, because we believe that every great story starts with a single person making a choice. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.